Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be finishing out this saga with the Caracal 816. Now, full disclosure on the Caracal 816A2 is that I have absolutely no relationship with Caracal USA or Caracal in the UAE either. This upper was actually sent in to me along with the BRN4, along with the SIG 516, by a very kind viewer of the channel who allowed me to use it as if it was my own for the past 6 weeks or so. Now, as always, ammo is supplied by Callaway Ballistics. Go ahead and check them out and use code FOCUS to save yourself some money. And if you want access to additional content, giveaways, and a bunch of random nonsense, go ahead and check out my Subscribe Star. Now, I know we talked about it a little bit last week, but to properly frame the existence of the Caracal 816, we need to go all the way back to the HK 416. Now, on the original HK 416, one of the designers by the name of Robert Hurt, he eventually moved on to SIG and then joined another engineer by the name of Chris Royce, and together they came up with the SIG 516, which was essentially a product improved H&K 416. I've shot the BRN4 and the SIG 516, and in my personal opinion, the SIG 516 is basically a step up in every direction from the original HK 416, but of course, after the second generation of the SIG 516, they discontinued it and moved on to the MCX, which has so many different variations at this point that I cannot possibly begin to go over them in this video. Now, that's not where the story ends, because eventually Caracal decided they needed to produce a rifle because the UAE is not necessarily known as a manufacturing powerhouse, even though they have the technology to do so, so they wanted to design a rifle quote-unquote in-house. And the best way to do that is to poach two of the best engineers on the planet, and that is going to be Robert Hurt and Chris Royce. So they came up with the Caracal 816, which is what we have here. Now, this is in some ways a product improvement over the older SIG 516. It's very, very similar to the SIG 516, but it's also a little bit specialized for the UAE, and in a couple ways makes it worse for people like us back in the States. It's also very important to mention that the Caracal US 816 has a couple noticeable differences between its UAE counterpart. Now, getting into the basics of what this rifle is, this is a 11.5 short stroke piston operating system. Caracal offers these in, I believe, 11.5, 14.5, and 16-inch variations. They also have a DI line of ARs that I would not recommend for any reason whatsoever, because again, there's just so many good ARs out there. I don't know why you would go to Caracal for a DI AR when they're most known for the 816, which is an actual interesting piston rifle. On top of that, these also sit at kind of an interesting value proposition because these are newly manufactured. You can go and buy them from Caracal US's website, and their price comes in at about $1,200 for the upper receiver, which for a complete piston operating system for an upper is actually pretty good. That slots in right there with like what the older SIG 516 would have been, what the PWS uppers will be, around that $1,200 to $1,500 price tag. So while it's not necessarily a high value upper receiver, it is competitive with the other dedicated piston rifles on the market. Now, starting off with the barrel on the Caracal 816, this is one of the two major components that was changed for the US market. So this barrel is a 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel 1 in 7 twist 5.56 chambering in a nitride finish. It is not cold hammer forged, and it is not chrome lined. The UAE version is both of those things. Now, Caracal US says in their own independent testing that there's no difference in terms of the longevity if they use a higher quality coating, or at least a tougher coating, and use a better manufacturing process. And while I'm not necessarily going to call them liars, I will certainly point out their financial incentive to cut corners and cut costs in the manufacturing process. As far as the actual profile of the barrel itself, it's what I would consider to be a middleweight profile. In the back, you have about a .70 barrel to a .75 gas block journal, and then at the end again, it's about a .7-ish size barrel, which is perfectly fine. It's a very balanced profile. It's not too light, it's not too heavy, again, perfectly in the middle, so I don't have any issues with that. And when we get into accuracy and performance at distance later on, it did perform quite well. Now, another very interesting thing about this barrel that is a quote-unquote improvement over the SIG 516 or a lot of ARs on the market in general is that in the barrel extension itself, there is a reinforcement behind the extractor. And what that does is when there's a round seated in the chamber and the extractor is engaged, the extractor itself is fully supported. That means if you have some sort of catastrophic malfunction or some sort of barrel obstruction, that pressure cannot come back or out the sides towards the shooter, it can only go down the barrel. And the barrels are designed to handle that sort of increased pressure. So from a safety perspective, that is technically on paper better, but it's one of those things where it is technically better in the 1 in a million chance that you get some sort of catastrophic barrel obstruction or some sort of other malfunction that would require that pin. It is a cool feature to have, but again, it's not necessarily needed, but it is just one slight improvement. Now, another thing that I do want to make clear is that you have to remember the UAE has a very different set of issues and geography compared to wherever you might live in the US. So for them, they might be much more worried about sand or other obstructions in the actual bore than we are here, because of course we're in the US and not in the middle of the desert. So again, for them, for the environment in which it was designed, makes a lot of sense. Is it needed for you? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. Moving on to the handguard. This is kind of an improvement over the SIG 516 handguard in the fact that it is a lot slimmer, a lot lighter. It is M-LOK on the 3, 6, and 9 full pick on top. I do like that quite a bit. It is a lot slimmer. And again, this is one of the other major differences between the US version and the UAE version. The UAE is still using the quote-unquote older style quad rails for their military rifles. And again, for a military application, when you are mounting a lot of stuff on your rail, the quad rail is in general going to be a little bit better. You're sacrificing a couple ounces at most on such a short rail, and you get a much more solid mounting platform. Now, kind of a side benefit of the M-LOK handguard is that to fit the gas block underneath it, which on the SIG 516 it was an exposed gas block, the gas block is actually a little bit smaller, a little bit trimmer on the Caracal 816 versus the SIG 516, so it is a little bit lighter weight as well because the gas block is a double pinned, completely steel affair. So cutting a little bit of weight there is, in my opinion, a good thing. The only real complaint that I have with the handguard itself is the lockup and retention method. This is the only handguard I've ever seen do this sort of thing. And to me, it's not confidence inspiring from a mechanical perspective. Even though I haven't had any issues with it, it's just a bit odd. So let's go ahead and get into that. So on the top of the handguard, you have 2 Allen screws in helicoils on your aluminum rail so that you don't strip out your aluminum rail. That's good. And then you torque those down onto a retaining piece that sits on top of the barrel nut. And that's it. The retaining piece is not attached to anything. It just kind of fits over the piston rod and sits on the barrel nut. So technically it can't move forward or back because it does fit into a little slot there. But as far as left and right play, it can kind of do whatever it wants. And again, the Allen screws aren't screwing into anything. They're just applying a little bit of pressure in just 2 very, very small areas. Now on the back of the handguard, you also have a key that slots into your upper receiver so it can't shift left and right. So I think technically the handguard works and will retain 0. It's just strange. I've never seen anything else like it. Before we move on to the BCG, we should talk about the operating system for just a minute. It is very, very similar to the SIG 516. So on the actual regulator itself, we have 3 different settings. We have our normal, adverse, and then of course our suppressed setting. You have 3 dimples on the gas regulator that denote how much flow. The biggest has the most flow, the smallest has the least flow. Now, as of this point in time, I have not cleaned or lubricated or maintained the piston assembly in any way, and it's a little sticky after about 1,000 to 1,200 rounds. So right now, technically speaking, the normal setting and the adverse setting are unlocked, so you can quickly add more gas if you need it. However, I almost got it. But at this point in time, they are not adjustable by hand. You will need to stick in an Allen key or a bullet or something like that if you wanted to adjust it in the fly. And then you do need to depress this detent to get it to the suppressed setting. And if you want to service it, which at this point it does need to be serviced, so probably every 500 to 1,000 rounds, I would recommend servicing it. You're going to need to flip it 180 degrees, pull it out the front, and then you can do all of your maintenance. Exactly like the 516, on the actual piston itself, you have gas rings, which allow you to have a very tight fit between your piston and your regulator, which means that you can make the gas port size on the barrel as small as possible to have the most efficient gas seal possible. One minor complaint though about the Caracal 816 is that it's a little bit over-gassed. Even on the suppressed setting with the YHM Turbo K with the Griffin dual lock system in the back for most of the review, I was using a CAC K-Spec extended buffer with a A5 H3 buffer and a rifle length spring, and it was still a little bit punchy. Not terrible by any means, but even with that very aggressive buffer and spring combo, it was still a little bit over-gassed. Whereas on the SIG 516, on the suppressed setting, again, I was using just carbine buffers, carbine springs, and that was a much softer shooting system overall. Not that the 816 is bad, and keep in mind, we're not really comparing apples to apples. The 516 that I tested was a 16-inch mid-length versus 11.5 carbine, so this one here is a little bit overgassed from what it could be. And that could also be just a Caracal thing that, again, in their area, they might need a little bit more gas to make sure the thing runs in more austere environments. Now, piggybacking off of that and moving on to the BCG, this is probably another thing that has to do with the environment for which it was designed. Now, on the SIG 516 on the right-hand side of the BCG, you have even more lightning cuts. However, on the Caracal 816, you have a complete wall of BCG to probably limit as much ingress as possible of foreign debris. So this is a lightweight BCG. If you take it out, it still has a lot of lightning cuts in the back and on the left-hand side of the BCG, but again, on the right-hand side, they left it complete to make sure that it's not dragging in debris with those extra cuts in it where you're gonna get sand and dirt in those cuts, then you're gonna fire, pull those things back into the system where they could end up who knows where. Now, what that means from a shootability standpoint is that you have a slightly heavier BCG combined with a system that's already a little bit overgassed, and that's where you get that slightly more violent recoil impulse. Now, again, keep in mind that this was designed for very, very sandy environments where they absolutely need to make sure that this thing runs because this is a military designed rifle. So all of those things combined together probably make it a little bit more reliable, but again, it depends on whether or not you need that for your specific application. Now, the BCG itself, again, the bolt is Carpenter 158, which is the mil-spec material, which is good. It is all black nitride, QPQ finish, whatever you guys want to call it. Works perfectly fine, seems to be good as of this point. I do want to note that after not cleaning or lubricating, I think I lubricated it once in about that 1200 rounds, there is some significant noticeable wear on all of your wear surfaces. Keep in mind that the nitride properties do penetrate into the material, so even if the top surface has worn off, you still have that corrosion and heat resistance baked into the material itself. Now, if you buy a complete rifle from Caracal, I believe it does ship with an H2 buffer. As you see it here, this is a H3 buffer and a flat wire spring. The CAC K5 system is actually sitting on my 14565 Creed, but that is for a video coming up shortly. Now, a couple other components that we should probably just mention briefly. There's nothing really too special about them. The upper receiver is a forged 7075 mil-spec upper receiver. No problems with that whatsoever. Again, it is slightly different with the cut in the front for the key on the handguard and for the piston assembly, so it's not true mil-spec, but it's very similar. Also, on the back of the upper receiver, you have this little cutout, which is very nice, and that fits the aperture for your rear iron sight, so it can actually fold all the way down, which is a very nice touch. And the charging handle that I'm using here, this is the Aero Breach charging handle, though it did come with a Strike Industries looking latchless design charging handle that is ambidextrous and did work just fine. I just like the some of the gas busting characteristics of this Aero Breach, and the wings are a little bit larger, which helps me to get around these iron sights. These iron sights are the Troy micro sights, which are perfectly fine iron sights. They are a little short for me personally. It might sound like I'm nitpicking or that I'm being overly negative about the Caracal 816, and that's not really the case. I do like it quite a bit. In fact, I think it might be the best desert rifle on the planet, but I don't live in a desert. I live in South Dakota, where the hardest thing that I come across is tall grass and cow pies. So again, for the intended user in the UAE, fantastic, excellent, designed to perfection by Chris and Robert. However, again, for the average guy in the US, this is a very cool novelty at a decent price and still a fantastic rifle, but you just might not need all of the features that it has because it's designed for somewhere halfway across the world that you probably can't find on a map. I can't either. Now, quickly going over shootability, reliability, and accuracy, because all of those things are going to end up being very simple. The shootability is good, but not as good as other piston rifles. So probably the worst on the market is either the HK416 or the BRN4. Those are going to be at the bottom of the stack. Then you're going to have the Caracal 816, and just above that, you're going to have the SIG 516, and then just above the 516, you're going to have most of the PWS rifles. The reason why I would give the edge to shootability of the SIG 516 over the Caracal 816 is that you have a slightly lighter BCG, and at least with this 11.5 versus that 16-inch, the 16-inch was a little bit softer gas with less recoiling mass. As far as the reliability goes on the 816, it was perfect, flawless, no issues whatsoever. In the video, you might notice some magazines not locking back. That is not the problem with the upper receiver. That is because I have mangled the lower receiver with a Aero PDQ lever, which, depending on what magazine I'm using, what buffers and circumstances, does not like to always lock back, which kind of makes it useless. Moving on to accuracy, with the 11.5-inch Caracal 816, with ball ammunition, we were getting decent results, somewhere between 2 and 3 MOA, and when we moved on to some of the heavier match loads, it would perform much closer to 1 MOA, which I am very happy with. Now, talking about taking this out to distance, I did take this out to 500 yards using the Vortex Diamondback 1-6, which I think is probably the best LPVO on the market currently, especially for a budget LPVO, and I mean sub $500 LPVO. It's probably the best one on the market currently. I think it is excellent at just about everything a budget LPVO can be excellent at. And with that optic comboed with Callaway Ballistics 77 grain Mark 2.62 clones, we were able to make effective hits all the way out to 500 yards. Now, I was using the Vortex BDC, but I was using the 600 yard hold and putting that on top of the target for 500 yards with a 11.5-5.56, which with very heavy ammunition. So as far as pros and cons go, starting out with the pros, it's accurate, it's reliable, it's over-engineered, and probably one of the best rifles for sandy or dirty environments. And number 4 is probably going to be the price. Even at $1,200, I think it is a lot cheaper than a lot of other piston uppers on the market. Moving on to downsides, it's a little bit heavier. It shoots a little bit worse than other upper receivers on the market, even other piston uppers on the market. And for $1,200, you could buy some top tier DI AR-15 uppers that have more parts compatibility. Another minor downside is, even though this might share some components with the AR-15, there are some things that you just can't do to it. And swapping out barrels or other things like that, you're going to lose the OTB feature on the Caracal barrel. So wrapping this thing up, I like the upper quite a bit. It functions quite well. It was designed perfectly for its intended use. If you want to pick these up as a fun gun, the value is kind of there for, again, a piston rifle. Gonna have all of your piston rifle downsides. Personally though, I kind of like the 5.16 a little bit more. Now, I wouldn't really recommend picking up one of those either, as those are discontinued, and you're gonna have a much harder time actually finding parts for those versus something that's actually in production. But again, that's just my 2 cents. So, with all of that out of the way, guys, let me know what you think of the Caracal 816. If you think it is the best piston fighting rifle on the market currently, or if it's just kind of a neat novelty here in the US. But with all of that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.